Imagine this. You're driving down a road. Everything is fine. But suddenly, a car cuts you off. Your heart races, your fists clench, the anger surges, just like that. You feel it in your chest, your throat, your temples. You can almost hear the pulse of your blood. Now, here's the real question. What do you do with that anger? You're holding the keys to your next move right now. Anger is not just an emotion. It's a state of being that has the power to alter everything about you, from how your body feels to how you think to what happens next in your life. You might think anger is just a reaction, but I'm here to tell you it's far more than that. It is a choice. And like all choices, it can either empower you or destroy you. Let me ask you, what do you want for yourself? Do you want to be someone who reacts with rage, letting your thoughts spiral out of control? Or do you want to be someone who holds the reins to your own emotions and shapes the world around you? Now, we know this scientifically. Anger activates your autonomic nervous system, specifically your fight or flight response. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate spikes. You begin to feel tense and rigid, almost as though you're preparing for battle. But here's what most people don't realize. Anger doesn't just affect your body. It affects your brain. The moment you let that anger take over, you're losing control of your prefrontal cortex, the very part of your brain responsible for decision-making, rational thinking, and impulse control. Instead, the primitive part of your brain, the amygdala, takes charge. And when the amygdala is in control, your capacity to think clearly, to reason, and to make decisions is diminished. But you've heard it before, haven't you? Don't act in anger. But there's more to it than just taking a breath and trying to calm down. What we now know is that anger can shape your future if you allow it to. In fact, repeated bursts of anger can lead to chronic inflammation in the brain, disrupting not just your emotional state, but also your mental clarity, your focus, and your memory. Over time, this leads to burnout, anxiety, and a significant decrease in your overall well-being. But here's the good news. You have the ability to override this response. You have the ability to train your brain to rewire how you react and to prevent anger from hijacking your life. This is where neuroscience comes in. It's not about suppressing anger, because that doesn't work long term. It's about understanding that your brain and body are malleable. They can be trained just like muscles. And if you train your brain to respond differently to anger, you'll find a completely new level of peace and clarity. You see, when you recognize anger as a signal rather than a state, you begin to gain control. Anger isn't a problem to be eradicated, it's a message. It's a signal that something isn't aligned with your values, your goals, or your sense of safety. The problem arises when you let that signal trigger an automatic, destructive response. What if, instead of reacting, you ask yourself, what is this anger trying to tell me? The moment you shift from reacting to responding, you've already won. You break the cycle of reactivity and you create space for your prefrontal cortex to engage. Your thoughts become clearer, your choices more intentional, and your actions more aligned with your true self. This is how you reclaim control. You can harness the power of deep breathing. Something as simple as exhaling slowly, counting to 4 on each breath. This stimulates your parasympathetic nervous system, calming your entire body, slowing your heart rate, and putting the brakes on that adrenaline rush. You can also practice mindfulness, allowing yourself to observe your anger without judgment, to examine it, and then decide how you want to respond. But most importantly, you need to embrace this truth. Your emotions are not your identity. Anger is a feeling, a temporary state, not a permanent label on who you are. So next time you feel that spark of anger, pause, breathe, recalibrate, and realize that in that single moment, you can either fuel the fire or extinguish it. The choice is always yours. Let's begin with the foundational truth about anger. It's not just an automatic reaction, it's a choice. I know that might sound counterintuitive because when anger rises, it can feel so visceral, so immediate, You feel the heat in your chest, the tightening in your jaw, the flood of thoughts that fuel the fire. But here's where the power lies. How you choose to respond to anger can entirely change the outcome of any situation. We often think of anger as something that happens to us. Someone cuts us off in traffic, or someone says something hurtful, and suddenly anger takes over. But anger, like any emotion, doesn't just emerge from nowhere. It's a signal that something has happened that we interpret as a threat, an injustice, or a violation of our expectation. And in that moment, we have the opportunity to decide whether we will let that signal turn into a full-blown emotional storm, or whether we will step back, observe it, and choose a response. This is the critical juncture, because if you can step back for even a split second and recognize that you can choose your response, you've already begun to break the cycle of automatic emotional reaction. You can rewire your brain to shift from the default setting of anger to one of mindful awareness and thoughtful response. This isn't about suppressing your anger or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about realizing that the anger you feel is an emotion, not a mandate to act impulsively. You can take a moment, breathe, and consciously decide how to channel that energy. Do you want to let it take over? Or do you want to step into a more intentional space where you choose how to respond, not just react? By making this shift, you're essentially training your brain to gain more control over your emotional state. And over time, that skill will strengthen. What may seem like an instinctive, uncontrollable reaction can be transformed into a deliberate, powerful choice. And this shift has the potential to not only change how you handle anger, but also how you move through every other emotion that arises in your life. When we talk about the effects of anger on the body and brain, we need to understand just how deep the impact goes. Anger isn't just an emotional experience. It's a full body response that triggers a cascade of physiological changes. This is not a random or insignificant reaction. It's hardwired into your biology, stemming from the primitive parts of your brain designed to protect you. Anger activates your autonomic nervous system, which controls unconscious functions like heart rate and digestion, and it pushes you into what we call the fight or flight mode. When this happens, your body is flooded with stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones are part of the body's response to perceived threats. Your heart rate spikes, your blood pressure rises, your muscles tense up, and your focus narrows, all preparing you for a quick response. Your body is in survival mode, and every instinct is telling you to either confront or escape the situation. This fight or flight response was incredibly useful for our ancestors when faced with real, immediate dangers. But in today's world, we face a different kind of threat, often emotional, social, or situational, and not one that requires an aggressive reaction. The problem is, this physiological response doesn't just shut off after the anger subsides. If you stay angry for too long, or if you experience frequent bursts of anger, it can have a lasting effect on your body. Elevated cortisol levels, for example, have been linked to chronic stress, inflammation, and even cognitive decline. Over time, constant activation of your stress response can wear down your immune system, disrupt your sleep, and lead to higher levels of anxiety and depression. The physical toll of anger can be severe, and the more you let it dictate your emotional landscape, the more damage it can do. But what's often overlooked is the impact anger has on your brain. When anger floods your system, it hijacks your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thinking, self-control, and decision-making. The prefrontal cortex gets pushed aside, and the amygdala, the brain's emotional center, takes over. This is why in moments of anger, your thinking becomes clouded, your impulses become stronger, and your capacity for clear judgment is reduced. The more this cycle is allowed to continue, the harder it becomes to break free from its grip. When anger takes over, it does something far more profound than just make us feel upset. It literally alters how our brain functions in that moment. Specifically, it undermines the very parts of your brain responsible for reasoning and decision-making. The prefrontal cortex, which sits right behind your forehead, is your brain's executive center. This area is crucial for tasks like problem-solving, self-control, empathy, and making well-considered decisions. But when you're angry, this part of your brain takes a backseat and another part, the amygdala, takes control. The amygdala is a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons deep in the brain. It's part of the limbic system, and its primary job is to process emotions, particularly fear, and to trigger an immediate response when it perceives a threat. This is a part of your brain that evolved millions of years ago to keep you safe in dangerous situations. Think of it as your brain's alarm system. But the problem arises when that alarm system goes off in response to everyday irritants, like a rude comment or a traffic jam. In these situations, the amygdala reacts quickly and instinctively, activating your body's fight or flight response without allowing you to fully process the situation. This means that when you're angry, your brain isn't thinking clearly. The prefrontal cortex, which helps you regulate your emotions, think through the consequences of your actions, and make thoughtful decisions, gets temporarily shut down. In its place, the amygdala drives your behavior, which is often impulsive and emotionally charged. This explains why we might say or do things in anger that we later regret, because the rational thinking that normally helps us weigh the pros and cons of our actions is essentially offline. What's important to understand here is that this shift in brain activity isn't something you consciously control. It's part of your brain's survival mechanism, but it can be incredibly disruptive in modern life. The key, however, is that this process is reversible. With practice and awareness, you can learn to recognize when the amygdala is taking over and engage your prefrontal cortex again, giving you the ability to think before you act and regain control over your emotion. The effects of anger are not confined to just the moment of emotional intensity. They can echo through your body and mind long after the anger has passed. Repeated episodes of anger, especially when they're frequent or intense, can lead to lasting physical and psychological consequences. One of the most significant of these is chronic inflammation in the brain, a condition that develops when the stress response is triggered too often. When anger floods your system, your body releases cortisol and other stress hormones, which over time can lead to a state of chronic inflammation. This is not just an inconvenience, it's a serious physiological problem that can disrupt everything from your immune system to your cognitive function. Chronic inflammation is associated with a number of health issues, including cardiovascular problems, autoimmune diseases, and a range of mental health disorders. When the brain experiences repeated inflammation, it can begin to affect cognitive processes like memory, focus, and the ability to think clearly. This is because inflammation can disrupt the delicate balance of neurotransmitters and hormones in the brain, impairing your ability to think, reason, and make decisions in the way you normally would. If this process continues unchecked, you might start to notice an overall decrease in mental clarity, mood swings, or even a sense of brain fog. Beyond cognitive decline, chronic anger can contribute to a vicious cycle of anxiety and depression. The stress response, when chronically activated by ongoing anger, increases your vulnerability to these mental health conditions. Your body is constantly in a state of high alert. Your stress hormones are perpetually elevated, and your ability to relax or recover diminishes. This creates a downward spiral where anger breeds more stress, which in turn leads to more anger, setting off a feedback loop that can be difficult to break. Over time, the accumulation of these negative effects can erode your well-being, making it harder to function in everyday life. But the good news is that this is not permanent. Understanding the impact of chronic anger is the first step in breaking the cycle and taking control of your emotional health. The more you recognize the physical and mental costs of holding on to anger, the easier it becomes to choose a healthier response, ultimately leading to greater clarity, peace, and emotional resilience. Anger is far more than just a fleeting emotion. It's a force that, when left unchecked, can shape the trajectory of your life in ways you might not even realize. When you allow anger to dictate your responses, it becomes a powerful lens through which you perceive the world. Over time, this lens distorts how you interact with others, how you make decisions, and how you move through life. You begin to view situations not as they are, but as threats to your values, your beliefs, or your sense of control. And this distorted lens can lead to decisions that you may later regret. driving a wedge between you and the things you truly care about. One of the most insidious effects of letting anger control you is that it often leads to poor decision making. When you're angry, you're not thinking with your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, reasoning, and making rational choices. Instead, your decisions are governed by impulse, emotion, and the immediate need to act, often without considering the long-term consequences. You might say something hurtful to a loved one, lash out at a coworker, or make a decision that jeopardizes your personal or professional well-being. In these moments, the choices you make are often fueled by a reaction to the emotional intensity of the moment, rather than by careful thought and reflection.
But this doesn't just affect the decisions you make in that instance. It compounds over time. Each decision made in anger, each reaction that stems from a place of heightened emotion, reinforces the neural pathways in your brain that link anger with action. The more often you respond this way, the more entrenched those pathways become, making it easier for anger to take over the next time you're faced with a challenging situation. Essentially, you train your brain to go into anger mode, and it becomes more difficult to break out of that cycle. The longer you allow anger to shape your decisions, the more it influences the trajectory of your relationships, career, and overall happiness. You may find yourself isolated, regretful, or even stuck in a cycle of anger-driven choices that you can't seem to escape. But the great news is that you don't have to let anger dictate your life. By recognizing its power and learning to channel it in healthier ways, you can reshape how you respond to life's challenges, leading to better outcomes and a more fulfilled, peaceful existence. One of the most powerful shifts you can make when it comes to handling anger is to change how you view it, not as a problem to suppress, but as a signal to pay attention to. Anger is not inherently bad. It's not an emotion to fear or to try to eliminate from your experience. Instead, it's a message, a signal from your brain and body that something is misaligned, something needs your attention, or something is threatening your values, beliefs, or sense of safety. The key is understanding that anger is telling you something important about your environment or your internal state. When you reframe anger in this way, you take away its power to automatically escalate and spiral out of control. Anger often arises when we feel wronged, misunderstood, or unfairly treated. And it's natural to experience that surge of emotion when our boundaries are crossed or when something threatens what we care about. But it's in how we process that anger that determines its effect on us. If you simply react to it, allowing it to hijack your emotions and push you toward impulsive actions, you're essentially ignoring the message behind the emotion. You're not giving yourself the chance to understand the underlying cause of your anger. This is where the real power lies. Instead of reacting to anger, ask yourself, what is this feeling trying to tell me? By shifting your mindset and seeing anger as a signal rather than a directive, you create an opportunity for reflection. You can pause for a moment and inquire within yourself, what specifically triggered this anger? Is it something about the situation or the person that is out of alignment with my values or expectations? Or is it a deeper internal issue, perhaps a sense of insecurity or fear that's being triggered by an external event? This process of inquiry not only allows you to gain clarity, but it also opens the door for you to take thoughtful, purposeful action rather than acting out of pure emotion. Understanding anger in this way can transform your entire approach to life's challenges. Instead of reacting impulsively, you're able to step back, process, and respond in a way that aligns with your true self and values. And in doing so, you take away the destructive power of anger, turning it into an opportunity for growth and self-awareness. The good news is that you don't have to be a slave to your emotional reactions. Just as we can train our muscles to become stronger through exercise, we can train our brains to respond differently to anger and other intense emotions. This process is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. What this means is that the way you typically react to anger can be rewired over time with consistent practice and awareness. It starts with understanding that anger is a learned response. Every time you react to a situation with anger, your brain forms neural pathways that reinforce that pattern of behavior. The more often you react in this way, the more entrenched these pathways become, making it easier for anger to take over the next time you face a challenge. But the opposite is also true. The more you practice responding to anger in a healthier way, the stronger those new, calmer pathways become. This doesn't happen overnight. Just like physical training, rewiring your emotional responses takes time and effort. One of the most effective tools for retraining your brain is mindfulness. When you're mindful, you're able to observe your emotions without judgment or reaction. Rather than simply reacting to anger as soon as it arises, mindfulness allows you to create a gap between the stimulus, the event or person that triggered your anger, and your response. In that space, you have the power to choose how to react. Another powerful technique is the use of deep breathing. Slow, controlled breathing activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts the fight or flight response triggered by anger. When you practice deep breathing regularly, you can train your body to respond more calmly when anger arises. This physical response helps calm the mind, giving you the space to reflect and choose how to proceed. Over time, as you practice these techniques, you'll find that your brain becomes more adept at handling anger with less emotional intensity. You'll develop the ability to step back, recognize your emotional state, and choose a response that aligns with your values and long-term goals, rather than simply reacting in the heat of the moment. Through consistent practice, you build a new emotional resilience that becomes your default mode. This is the power of neuroplasticity. You are not stuck with your emotional reactions. You can train yourself to be calm, thoughtful, and in control, even in the face of challenges that would have once triggered a reactive, angry response. One of the most powerful tools you can use to gain control over anger in the moment is deep breathing. It might sound simple, but the impact of conscious, controlled breathing on your emotional and physiological state is profound. When you're angry, your body enters a heightened state of arousal. The heart rate increases, muscles tense, and your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. This is part of the fight or flight response, and it makes it harder for you to think clearly or act rationally. But the great thing about breathing is that by consciously altering your breath, you can quickly signal to your body that it's safe to calm down. Here's the science behind it. Deep, slow breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is often referred to as your rest and digest system. This system counteracts the sympathetic nervous system, the part of your body responsible for the fight or flight response. By taking deep, slow breaths, you send a signal to your brain that the immediate threat has passed and it's time to relax. This triggers a cascade of effects that help lower your heart rate, reduce blood pressure, and shift your body into a state of calm. As a result, you start to feel less tense, less reactive, and more in control.
There are several specific breathing techniques you can practice, but one of the most effective is the 4-7-8 method. Inhale deeply through your nose for a count of 4, hold your breath for a count of 7, and then exhale slowly through your mouth for a count of 8. This pattern helps regulate the breath and activates the parasympathetic nervous system. By practicing this technique regularly, you train your body and brain to respond more calmly in moments of anger. Over time, these breathing practices not only help you manage your anger in the moment, but they also build emotional resilience. The more you practice, the easier it becomes to enter a state of calm when anger arises, allowing you to respond with clarity and control rather than being swept away by emotion. Another crucial strategy in managing anger is mindfulness, specifically the practice of observing your anger without immediately reacting to it. Anger, like any emotion, is fleeting. It rises, peaks, and then passes. The challenge, however, is that when we become entangled in our emotions, especially anger, we often lose our ability to see the bigger picture. We're no longer observing the emotion, but mindfulness offers us a way out of that emotional identification. Mindfulness involves simply becoming aware of your emotions and bodily sensations without judgment. When anger arises, instead of reacting to it with impulsive actions or thoughts, mindfulness allows you to take a step back and observe it objectively. In that moment, you can ask yourself, what am I feeling? What triggered this anger? What is the physical sensation in my body right now? By observing anger in this way, you are creating a mental distance between yourself and the emotion, which prevents you from being swept away by it. This practice works because it disrupts the automatic, unconscious reactions that happen when anger takes over. Normally, when you're angry, the brain quickly focuses on the source of irritation and the desire to act, which often leads to rash decisions or words. But by practicing mindfulness, you begin to train your brain to simply notice the anger as it rises. You no longer allow it to control you, but instead you create a space for yourself to choose a different path. One of the key elements of mindfulness is the ability to acknowledge your emotions without judgment. We often judge ourselves for feeling anger, thinking that it's a sign of weakness or failure, but mindfulness teaches us to simply observe the emotion without attaching any negative labels to it. By accepting that anger is a natural response, you give yourself permission to feel it without fear of it consuming you. Over time, this practice strengthens your emotional awareness and control. Instead of reacting to every anger-inducing situation, you develop the capacity to notice anger as it arises, pause, and then decide how you want to respond. This shift may take time, but with consistent practice, mindfulness becomes a powerful tool for reducing the intensity and frequency of your anger. The more you practice observing your emotions, the less you will feel controlled by them, allowing you to respond to challenging situations with clarity and calm. One of the most liberating insights you can gain when it comes to anger is understanding that your emotions do not define who you are. Anger, like all emotions, is temporary. It comes, it rises, and it can pass just as quickly. Yet many of us make the mistake of identifying with our emotions as if they are a reflection of our true selves. When you're angry, it can feel as if you are anger, that the emotion is a permanent part of your identity. But the truth is, anger is just a transient state, not a reflection of your core being. This distinction is important because when you view anger as part of who you are, you create an emotional feedback loop. You might say things like, I'm just an angry person, or I always react this way. And the more you identify with that anger, the more you reinforce the neural pathways in your brain that connect your identity to that emotion. But by recognizing that anger is an emotion you experience, not who you are, you give yourself the power to separate from it. You are not your anger, and your anger does not define you. This shift in perspective allows you to take control. When you realize that you are not bound by your anger, you can begin to observe it without being overwhelmed by it. You can acknowledge the anger, understand that it's a natural and temporary feeling, and then choose how to respond. This separation gives you the mental space to engage your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought and decision-making, rather than being driven by the emotional impulse from the amygdala.